I own a company called Global Success Advisors, which is working with global boards and global leadership teams, discussing everything around global geopolitics, global economics, corporate strategies for business. The company also owns something called EMEA Business Group that works with heads of Europe, Middle East, Africa for big multinational companies. We work with more than 500 multinationals at the moment, and I'm also the author of 3 books on emerging markets and 1 on the global economy. Former executive VP from the Economist Group, where I spent almost 20 years. Global geopolitics is only going to get worse in the coming years. The rise of China is a big threat to the United States and the US-led global rules-based order. The United States understands that, but they not quite understand the speed with which China is moving and how fast they will kind of steal markets away from the United States under the BRI initiative, where they actually by 2049 would like to be the new center of the world when it comes to the New World Order. And that's 2049 was not randomly selected because that will be 100 years of the People's Republic of China. And they want to tell the world, look, socialism is superior to capitalism. We told you all along, most of the countries on this planet are with us. So I think we are moving now into a very difficult phase in global geopolitics that's going to lead to more corporate de-risking from China, but more than anything, there will be more and more decoupling, and also, in a way, 2 camps existing on the same planet. And this decoupling is going to get worse, and it will result probably in more proxy wars, with more social unrest in certain markets and so forth. This has huge implications for corporate strategies, because you have to think about your global supply chain. You have to think about your priority markets. Where should we put our resources? Which markets will give us a quicker return than the others? What are the places we should ignore for a while? It has massive implications for all corporations running business today. I think this geopolitical story has become much more complicated than the old Cold War with the Soviet Union. Because on the other side, the West sees a power that is actually economically powerful as well. It's not just that they have an ideology behind. If you're a typical multinational company from the United States or Europe, you're still relatively well protected in your home markets of Europe, US, and those developed countries that are quite rich. But then when you venture outside with your business to Latin America, Middle East, Africa, big parts of Asia and so on, you realize that you have some serious competition from Chinese companies that are coming after your business with really good products, increasingly, with superb technologies more and more, and at the same time they're much cheaper, which is a puzzle for many companies. How can they be so much cheaper than we are? And there are multiple reasons for this. There is a very long sequence that has been building up for 40 years of how China has risen and financed the rise of Chinese companies that are now impacting every single multinational out there. And that's not the only threat in this geopolitical story as well, because you have, at the same time, countries, more than 130 of them, that have signed up for the Chinese Belt Road Initiative. Those that are fed up with a global rules-based order and say we need someone else as a patron and help with economic development. And that means the real threat for multinational businesses that are incumbent big multinationals will come from those markets that have been left behind in the last 50 years, that the West has never allowed them to properly industrialize and so on, to rise in terms of poverty, etc. This is, I think, what's really important for every company to fully understand today, that the world is changing, it's changing incredibly quickly, and that if the pace of change outside in the external environment is quicker than your internal pace of change within a corporation, you have a problem. And the pace of change is incredibly fast at the moment. Especially, you have another complication here, which I think will be the second topic we will discuss today, is that the global economics is getting more volatile at the same time. which is due to the massive liberalization of global financial markets over the last 40 years. And you look at the frequency of economic crisis, it's just getting shorter and shorter all the time. Money moves in and out of certain markets, money moves in and out of commodities, money moves in and out of derivatives markets, etc., makes the whole financial system pretty unstable. But also it deeply affects international markets in multiple ways as well. Economics is a primitive science, still in many ways. It's similar to medicine about 100 years ago. And we see today in economics that a lot of economics has been hijacked by mathematics, by ideologies, by bad economic decision-making, because at the end of the day, I believe economics should be about doing things that are at the same time good for an individual, while at the same time good for the society in which these individuals are. And yet we see more and more extremes on both sides. Then you venture outside of this space and you realize the frequency of economic crisis, which goes like a horse and carriage together with the financial liberalization that we have seen over the last 40 years. You know, this liberalization of global finance was first visible in emerging market crisis of the 1980s, 1990s. And people often thought, oh, you are bad emerging market. You are not doing your reforms. This is why you're constantly poor and never able to rise out of your poverty. Suddenly, that becomes a global financial crisis in 2009 because that liberalization caught up with the developed markets as well. And then everybody's wondering, what do we do now when the whole world is falling apart in 2009? And they come up with this plan and say, we will print money. We'll add more monetary emission to the system. And everybody starts to do quantitative easing, so they don't call it money printing. But the monetary expansion becomes the fastest in economic history. And then if you add pandemic on top of that, between the early 2011 until the end of 21, global money supply more than doubled, which has never happened before. Without the central banks realizing, this is like pouring water in a bucket and it's spilling over already, and it's called inflation. This spillover is inflation, and they are sitting there and wondering, oh, don't worry, inflation rates will go away on their own, they said. Including Jay Powell, including the chairwoman of the European Central Bank, they called the inflation rate transitory. When in fact, you could see a massive amount of that liquidity that was created by all central banks spilling over into too much money out there chasing too few goods. And then today many central banks talk about we will only make decisions based on data. The trouble with this is the data is 3 months old by the time it's collected by statistical offices, so you're by definition always behind the curve. So I have been worried for a while about how economic policy making is done, how it often pleases some special interests, while at the same time it does affect everybody doing business around the world. Because that frequency of commodity prices going up and down, crisis in emerging markets, crisis in the developed world, it's difficult to navigate through this space if you're a CEO of a major multinational company. Because today everything is interconnected, from geopolitics, global economics, to the decisions that you make in your boardroom about where to expand, how to go about it, how do you guard against your rising competition all the time. And so global economics has become, I would say, it's gone from being primitive to perhaps even more primitive when it comes to economic policy decision-making. And I'm afraid, especially in emerging markets that have been left behind, that have never industrialized, you will see more and more crises over there as well. So today's headlines are very often negative about where the global economics is going in terms of the outlook for 2024, for example. But in fact, not everything is bleak, because we see the positive impact that interest rates have created. They are pushing prices lower at the moment, producer prices, inflation rates, which means when we come to Q2 24, there will be first cuts in interest rates taking place, which means we have some light at the end of the tunnel for the global economy. Of course, there are risks related to this. We don't know if any of the US banks will cause another financial crisis. We don't know whether to some extent the geopolitics might blow up somewhere between the big powers or somewhere in the Middle East, that it might impact the markets. These are kind of the events that can derail a relatively benign scenario for next year. But finally, as they woke up at the central banking level, raising rates, they are normalizing economic policy finally, and that means a gradually better outlook for 2024, for example. Big thing regarding corporate business trends, particularly in developing countries, we see even some of the largest multinational companies still believing that just by being present internationally, you will automatically become a market leader just like you in your home market. And they just think it's going to happen by default sometimes. So when we go into certain corporations, and we discuss this with our clients, you realize that market positions very often in international markets are much poorer than what they have at home, where they might be a market leader in this sector or that sector. You venture outside, and you have a lot of unknown competition that's kind of beating you all the time. And you're wondering, what did we do wrong? Maybe the market is not good enough, etc. What we have always found is there is a direct correlation between the dedicated resources, focus and attention and upfront investment that you need to put to be able to increase your local relevance and local resilience against rising competition in many countries around the world. Market leadership does not happen by default. You have to invest far ahead of the curve, take a long-term view, not be obsessed with quarterly numbers in some of these developing markets, because it takes time to properly build business. And so what we always recommend to our clients is to look at the internal gaps and say, we would like to be in this position in Brazil, or in this position in China, or in India, and so forth. And I tell them, look at what are your gaps in terms of your internal capabilities, gaps in terms of your local infrastructure and competencies. What are they? Look at them very carefully, and then try to close them as quickly as you possibly can, because competition in international markets is getting worse. Every single multinational is becoming more systematic in the way they approach international business. The long gone are the days when you could run your business internationally using only local partners. You have to move from opportunistic to systematic business development all the time, and everybody is doing it now, slowly but surely in many cases. But that competition from big multinationals is rising in all sectors. And then what's often being ignored in this picture is that there is a rise of the so-called emerging market multinationals. They are spreading their wings all over the place. Not only the Chinese, but many others as well. And they have raised their financing, debt financing, equity financing, and they are very aggressive in international markets, because if you move from one emerging market to another, you quickly realize, hey, this is similarly complicated as home. We feel at home immediately here, and we know how to do business in those locations. So at the moment, many of our big incumbent multinational companies are actually losing market share against some of these newcomers that have very big global ambitions. And then you have another layer of competition, which is quite interesting, and that is medium-sized companies from US, Europe, Japan, other Asian markets. Those with global ambitions who are venturing for the first time outside of their relatively narrow geographies. And so they are muddying the waters in international competition arena as well. And then you have purely local players that many multinationals completely ignore. And they say, well, these are small local players, we're not that worried about these guys. But in reality, they can be very powerful competitors as well, because they have different compliance rules, they are quick. Some of our clients call them street fighters. So they are on the streets doing business, they're quick, they don't have very cumbersome decision-making policies in their companies. So our clients at the moment are facing rising competition from multinationals, rising competition from emerging market multinationals, rising competition from medium-sized players in the developed world, and then purely local street fighters, who get a lot of funding recently as well, either from their banks or they do some local IPOs of some kind, and so forth. And in this space, when you aggregate all of this, the name of the game at the end of the day for all multinationals now is, how do I build a sustainable business that will consistently outperform our competition, whoever they are? And so in order to do this properly, first you have to redo your competitive mapping again and say, who are we really competing against? Who are the newcomers to the scene? Do we really know what they're selling and at which prices? And what does that mean for our product portfolio? Maybe our product portfolio is wrong now for emerging markets. Maybe we need to do something else. But at the end of the day, it's about outsmarting competition, outlasting, so you can grow every year in and out. And then the only way you can do this is by boosting your local relevance, local resilience, by constantly putting more resources even into places that may not appear particularly attractive in the short term. It is a long-term game at the end of the day. When I go into a company at the global level, for example, or I do a speech at their internal event or a conference of some kind, I am not only the guy who will talk about global geopolitics, global economics, global business. I also act as a filter. Because all of these corporate opinions, meeting, consultations that we make with 500 plus multinational clients that we have, feeds our thinking as well. And I can channel the biggest global trends, discussions in other companies, and say, okay, this is really being discussed at the board levels at the moment. Global executive leadership teams, that's what they are talking about at this stage. And maybe if you're not thinking about this, maybe you should, because other companies are going in this direction. So we do act whenever we go to any corporation talking about some of these global issues, whether it's business, geopolitics, or economics, and everything is, of course, incredibly interconnected. Acting as a filter actually is a very powerful thing.